Okay, hi there. I'm Dr. Samuel Mitchum, and I'm going to talk to you about some war stories from a book I wrote, Voices from the Confederacy. And this is just for fun. I figured you might enjoy some stories. I want to talk about desertion today. It was a problem in both armies. One of the peak desertion periods in the war occurred after the Emancipation Proclamation, when roughly 20% of the Union Army of the Potomac joined what they called the Blue Ridge Corps because they didn't want to fight for the liberation of slavery. In the Confederate Army, the peak desertions occurred after the fall of Atlanta, and especially after the Battle of Nashville, when it became increasingly evident that the Confederacy was not going to prevail. Although there were desertions, of course, before that. And it varied highly. There is no rule of thumb about what happened to a Confederate deserter. One of them was Thomas J. Moakley, who was with the 48th Georgia. He said that he, quote, received a letter from my wife making it necessary for me to go home. He applied for furlough, and that was declined. So he went home anyway, and then came back later. And they were very lenient with Moakley. They sentenced him to 30 days bread and water, but the punishment was never carried out. So he basically got away with it. He attributed his salvation to God. One of the more interesting cases was Edward Cooper. He was a young artilleryman, and he deserted and went on trial. He pled not guilty for some reason. But the judge advocate had no problem proving all the charges and specifications against him. And Cooper didn't present a defense, and the presiding officer, Colonel Cullen Battle of the 3rd Alabama, said, surely you have a reason. You would not desert your comrades and your colors in the face of the enemy for no reason. And Cooper said, I had a reason, but it would avail me nothing in front of a military court. And Battle said, you may be mistaken. Otherwise, you're going to be found guilty and sentenced to death. And without further ado, Cooper presented a letter to the colonel, which brought tears to his eyes. I'm going to read it to you. It's from his wife. It said, my dear Edward, I have always been proud of you, and since your connection with the Confederate Army, I have been even prouder of you than ever before. I would not have you do anything wrong for the world, but before God, Edward, unless you come home, we must die. Last night, I was aroused by little Eddie's crying and said, what is the matter, Eddie? And he said, oh, Mama, I'm so hungry. And Lucy, Edward, your darling little Lucy, which is his daughter, she never complains, but she is growing thinner and thinner every day. And before God, Edward, unless you come home, we must die. Well, Cooper naturally applied for furlough. It was turned down. He applied again, turned down again, so he deserted. And when he went home, his wife embraced him and said, I'm so glad you got your furlough. Well, he stiffened at that remark, and she realized immediately what he had done. And she said, you did get your furlough, didn't you, Eddie? And before he could answer, she said, you must go back. You cannot desert. You must go back. So he did, and he was arrested and tried before the court-martial. And some of the judges openly wept. But they had no choice. They convicted him, and they sentenced him to death. And the conviction was sent to General Lee for his confirmation. And Lee wrote a 2-sentence answer. The verdict of the court is affirmed. The accused is hereby pardoned and will return to his company. Later, Cooper's battery was battered by Union artillery in a major battle. Everybody was killed or wounded. And Colonel Battle, who was a general by this point, rode up and saw Cooper who recognized him immediately. There was blood all over Cooper. And he said, "Have I redeemed the honor of Mary and Lucy?" And General Battle raised his hat, and Cooper fired the last round from the cannon, fell to the ground, and died shortly thereafter. Not all desertions ended good. A lot of them did end badly. Although there was a planner, and he promised when the soldier left for the war that he would take care of his wife and make sure she was provided for. And he didn't. He made an indecent proposal and would not sell her food or give her food unless she submitted. Well, she wrote her husband and told him about this, applied for furlough, and it was declined twice. So he deserted, went home, kidnapped the planter, tied him to a tree, and flogged him until he received a promise for better treatment for his wife. And I feel sure he got it. Then he returned to the Army. The commanding officer decided not to prosecute him, so he got away scot-free. Some did, some didn't. General Forrest was hard on deserters. In the Battle of Fort Pillow, they were accused of killing some African Americans after they'd surrendered. But they were much rougher on deserters. These deserters were from West Tennessee, where one of Forrest's regiments had been, and the Forrest men knew who the deserters were by name. And they captured 64 deserters and executed 47 of them. Just simply forced them to their knees and shot them in the back of the head, spared them the ordeal of a lengthy trial. So there was no regular way to do it. Some got off scot-free. Before the Atlanta campaign in early 1864, General Joe Johnston's army was plagued by desertions. Well, Johnston made an unofficial agreement with the deserters. They could go home, plant their fields, but they had to come back when the Yankees started attacking and Sherman began his drive on Atlanta, which happened in early May. Well, most of the deserters did come back. They were not punished, and they fought the rest of the war or until they were killed as part of the Army of Tennessee. General Pickett kind of made a mess of it. He hated deserters. And after Pickett's charge, his unit was sent to North Carolina to regroup, where it got involved in several minor battles with Yankees. He attacked the 2nd North Carolina Union Regiment, which consisted largely of what you call buffaloes, former Confederates who had deserted. And they identified 22 of them. And Pickett, I can't tell you his exact words because they were very profane, but he determined to kill them all, tried them, and had them executed. And he had them executed in front of their wives and children, which was considered harsh. And some of the Yankees decided that there should be retaliation, among them Abraham Lincoln, but also Secretary of War Stanton. But the next month, March 1864, Ulysses S. Grant became General-in-Chief of the Union Army, and he and Pickett had gone to West Point together, and they were friends, and their friendship survived the war. And Grant wrote a letter to Joseph E. Johnston and said he would not hold it against any Confederate officer who executed someone who had deserted the Confederate Army and joined the Union Army. Grant had no problem with these people being shot. And that's the way it continued until the end of the war. And, of course, Lincoln was assassinated, and Secretary of War Stanton was very hateful. So was his judge advocate, James Hoyt. He demanded an investigation of what had happened with Pickett. Well, Pickett, I think, probably prudently took his family to Montreal, Canada at that point. And stayed there until Ulysses S. Grant became President of the United States. Grant quashed the proceedings and even offered Pickett a job as U.S. Marshal for North Carolina. Pickett declined it, went to the insurance business where he was not successful, and eventually died in obscurity and in poverty. So that's kind of the way it worked with deserters. Everything was different from place to place, and there's no rule of thumb in how they were handled by the Confederacy.